Hello, everyone. My name is Brandon Calhoun. I am the current president and a founding member of LBCC's Civil Discourse Club. Our club's mission is to promote dialogue. Thank you. Our club's mission is to promote dialogue that enhances understanding among individuals with diverse perspectives in an open and respectful environment. This mission started about a year and a half ago during an artwork controversy that occurred on our campus. At the time, our campus community was highly polarized with little to no engagement with those of differing perspectives on the artwork. During this time, a small group of students decided to get together and hold a debate that did not aim on producing a winner or a loser. But instead, our goal was to accurately portray different perspectives of those that were being produced on in echo chambers on our campus for the purpose of learning. This work continues today through our guest presenters.
Hi, I'm Trevor Lane, and I'm going to be the vice president of the Civil Discourse Club next year. A lot of people were involved in putting on this event, and we'd just like to take a minute to recognize them. First, we would like to give a really big thank you to LBCC's Free Expression team. Without them, this would not have been possible. We'd also like to thank the Village Square and Respect and Rebellion, who aim to provide a forum for competing ideas. They are also responsible for these incredible speakers that we have joining us today. And lastly, we'd like to thank Bridge USA, a national nonpartisan organization who are seeking to bridge the political divide on college campuses through ideological diversity and constructive and responsible discourse. We, the Civil Discourse Club, are proud to say that we're the only Bridge chapter at a community college. And with that privilege, we are proud to present this event.
Hi everyone, my name is Aja Rayburn and I'm the incoming president for the Civil Discourse Club. I'd like to provide some background information about our speakers, John and Kieran. John is a social conservative working to reform the conservative movement, and he supports an active church. Kieran takes a more progressive approach to social issues and supports an active government. They met as early leaders of the political movement Better Angels, which was founded on the idea that humanity bonds us together, and that's about the only thing that can explain their friendship. These guys really disagree on big things that matter, but that's okay. So today we'd like to welcome John and Kieran to talk about how they do that with respect and understanding while maintaining their personal identities.
Thank you, guys. Hello, everyone.
Hey, hello, Oregon. Linn-Benton Community College, all right.
Can you guys hear us okay? Cool.
Okay, beautiful.
Well, thank you guys, Aja, Trevor, Brandon, and thank you to Mark Urista especially for bringing us here, and to the Village Square, which organized this speaker series. You guys are the second college we went to. We went to Berkeley 3 weeks ago, which was really fun and interesting. It's really great to be in Oregon. So
people were really lovely. Nothing got trashed. Nothing got burned or anything like that.
Yeah, they didn't throw any tomatoes at John, shockingly.
Shockingly, right? I was ready to duck, but it wasn't necessary.
So I'm Ciaran O'Connor.
I'm John Wood Jr.
And we are from Better Angels. Better Angels is a national citizens movement to try to bring liberals and conservatives together with the goal of depolarizing America.
That's right.
So what does that mean, depolarization?
Well, so political depolarization has to do with basically creating a context, what we would call a context for empathy in our political dialogue. A major part of what is sort of what's afflicting our civic culture right now is our tendency to balkanize and to sort of pivot into tribes and tribal thinking, where we find ourselves sort of unable to recognize the humanity in people who have differing political points of views. And it's tempting to think sometimes that if you've got the right answer to a policy question, you should be able to sort of win a polemical argument, and that should lead to political progress. But that's not really how life works in a free society, in a democratic republic. There has to be a communal sort of context where we relate to each other as human beings in order for political progress to be sustained ultimately. And so that's a major part of what Kieran and I work on in our own relationship and what Better Angels works on. So, but before we get into that too much, it's worth understanding sort of the ways in which we know and recognize the fact that polarization is increasingly becoming a problem in American society. So Kieran, why don't you hit us with some context?
Yeah, so, I mean, I'm sure as you guys all know, we've always had deep ideological divides in this country since our founding. And that's sort of what our country is based on. Disagreement, being able to have discourse, and ultimately to try to find solutions and compromise. But as you guys have probably noticed, the division and polarization has been increasing over the past few years, and especially since the 2016 election. I mean, I'm sure if you go on social media, even having conversations with friends, family, at the workplace, the polarization has now sort of become this phenomenon where you don't just disagree with somebody, but if you do disagree with them, you start to think they're a bad person. Sometimes you think that they're fundamentally ill-intentioned or that their ideas are dangerous or even incomprehensible. And so this is what we call affective polarization. It's not just the belief that my political opponent is wrong, but it's the belief that he is potentially evil or even irredeemable. Mm-hmm. We start to see this culture sometimes where people, because of their views, it's almost like, okay, you said this, well then you're dead to me. Right. And obviously that's bad for our civic society. And so you can see it in statistics as well. So like in the 1960s, for example, they asked people, would you have a problem if your son or daughter married someone of the opposite political party? And in 1960, only 5% of people said, yeah, that'd be a deal breaker. Now that number is over 50%. Over 50% of people have said that they've unfriended people on social media because of politics. Mm-hmm. I'm sure even people here have done that. I mean, social media obviously intensifies the phenomenon.
Right. One out of six Americans either ended or substantially lessened a personal relationship with a family member or a friend directly as a result of how they voted in the 2016 election. In 1994, Pew asked Americans, Pew asked the question, what percentage of Americans have a personally negative feeling towards people of the other party? That figure was at about 20% on each side of the aisle back in 1994. 20 years later, that figure had risen to about 55% or so on either side. So it's a dramatic shift in the way that we think about each other as Americans. Suddenly the fact that we are Democrats or Republicans winds up becoming more important than the fact that we share sort of what should be a fraternal bond as members of this country. And so just to sort of put a little bit of psychological context on top of that, I don't know, how many of you are familiar with the work of a social scientist named Jonathan Haidt, or have heard about a book called The Righteous Mind? Okay, see some hands going up. One of the things that Professor Haidt talks about in this book is the fact that the human mind is not so much a logic processor, but a story processor, ultimately. We like to think of ourselves, particularly in politics, right, as being rational people. We like to think that if an argument makes sense, we will believe it, and that when we make arguments, we make them knowing that we are operating from a place of logical objectivity. I don't know about you, Kieran. I'm always objective and everything.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, right? Which is weird because we disagree, and yet we're both totally objective. So, like, how does that
work?
How does that happen? Well, the truth is we're both lying to ourselves, right? And that's kind of part of Professor Haidt's point. He has this metaphor that he uses of the elephant and the rider. And with the rider representing the human sort of rational mind, our tendency to sort of articulate the reasons behind why we think a certain way. But the elephant, the much bigger thing that carries the rider, is actually our sort of emotional and moral intuitional center, you know? It's the way we feel about things. And the rider is just sort of like a press secretary, sort of, you know, providing rationale for what it is the emotions think and so forth. And so why do I say all that? I say all that to basically make the point that at the end of the day, if we're going to understand each other as fellow Americans, and with an aim towards creating a culture of understanding, we need to understand where one another are coming from, right? It's not enough for us to just try and dissect and dismantle the weaknesses we perceive in one another's arguments, because ultimately, even if we think each other's arguments are silly, those arguments are coming from places of real experience. as a part of what we want to do is sort of share a little bit of our stories in terms of how it is we came to our own political points of view, because we do have things in common, frankly. But
We have a lot in common, I'd say.
I'd say, but they're nested in the context of some, some striking political differences that come from some similarities, but also some differences in our personal stories. So, Kieran, why don't you share a little bit about where you come from and how you got to be the, the major lefty that you.
Sure,
that you are
the
today.
major lefty, yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, so I grew up in New York City. I grew up in Manhattan. Both my parents were journalists. They both leaned pretty liberal. My dad especially, he was always fond of telling me when he was a kid how he was out in the streets protesting Nixon and getting tear gassed. And so I sort of grew up with this kind of liberal activist culture. And growing up in New York City, most of my friends were liberal. And it was interesting because growing up in New York, I've always thought of myself as somebody who valued diversity. I had friends from all different races, socioeconomic strata. I love taking the subway. I was like, this is how it should be, surrounded by people who are different. Mm-hmm. But then, when I started working with Better Angels, it kind of occurred to me, like, well, I actually haven't really been surrounded by political diversity. Right. I had always seen, I had some friends who had conservative views, but I had worked in Democratic politics. I had come from New York, and so I had sort of subconsciously in my mind kind of put conservatives into this space of like, they're the other, which kind of ran contrary to all these diversity values that I thought I espouse. And so one of the great things, in addition to all the work that we do about Better Angels, is actually kind of broadening my own mind and starting to get to work with conservatives like John and organizations across the spectrum that have liberals and conservatives. You kind of start to understand other people's stories, and then you challenge your own perspective, and ultimately that strengthens your own values and ideas and your own ability to articulate the argument, because you're actually speaking to people where they are, right, instead of just speaking from your own perspective or speaking to this kind of stereotype that you've come up with based on limited experience, or even worse, based on just your social media feed, right? So if I'm liberal, I don't have any conservative friends, and I'm just on Twitter all day following liberal journalists, they're just kind of highlighting the worst in the other side. And I start to just basically think, okay, anyone who's not on my team is a bad person, and why would I bother with them? And ultimately, then you're writing off half the country, and that's kind of the path that we're taking on. So Better Angels is sort of, and we're going to get in a little bit to what we actually do practically to try to bring people together. But that's sort of my story coming from the left, where I haven't really given up any of my core progressive values, but I started to value the opportunity to live and work and learn from people who I disagree with. And then lo and behold, I actually like John pretty much. So.
It's funny how you don't really have to abandon your core values in order to see the humanity in somebody else with a different perspective. So it's funny also because Kieran and my story sort of starts in a somewhat similar place. So I'm from multicultural Los Angeles, really. I grew up in Culver City, California. And I come from a sort of biracial and multicultural family, and really sort of a bipartisan family as well. When I was running for Congress in 2014, so I'm a former vice chairman of the Republican Party in LA and a former nominee for Congress out of Los Angeles. I ran against Maxine Waters in 2014, some folks may have heard of, I imagine. And when I was running, the district is largely an inner city, predominantly African-American Latino area. I live in South LA, erstwhile South Central Los Angeles. But there's a pocket of white, suburban, conservative voters. And so I had kind of a canned line that I used to use, whether I was talking to a black Democratic church in South LA or to a white Tea Party group in the South Bay. People would ask me, and I would say, they'd say, at the age of 26, what qualifies you to run for Congress, to represent a district as diverse and complex as the California 43rd? And I would tell people, I would say, well, I have something of a diverse parentage and background that gives me some perspective. My mother is a liberal black Democrat from inner city Los Angeles. My father happens to be a white conservative from Tennessee. I grew up explaining my father to my mother and my mother to my father, and that in a nutshell is why I can represent a lot of you. And so, baboom, right?
I've heard him use that line before.
It's old for him, but bringing out the hits. But it was, it's essentially a true thing. Now, in point of full transparency, my father was a person who became a conservative later in life. But he's a Kennedy Democrat, so was my grandfather. My grandfather was an interesting figure in his own right. Just a brief aside, my grandpa was a figure in the music industry, Randy Wood. In the 1950s, he started the first radio show to broadcast rhythm and blues and gospel music to a national audience, basically black music to a national audience. And after that, he founded a record label called Dot Records in 1956. It was America's biggest independent label, and Grandpa was personal friends with John Kennedy and Richard Nixon, Pat Brown, and so forth. Had a little bit of a political story in the Wood side. But as time went on, politics in the Democratic Party changed. My grandfather and my father were sort of the types of individuals who felt like the Democratic Party had left them behind in some respect. I was raised with all sorts of cultural influences, but within that was, sort of nostalgia and these Americana stories of people like Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone. And I could tell you that Davy Crockett killed a bear when he was only 3 and grew up, watching the Alamo and being a big fan of John Wayne and so forth, but really being steeped in sort of like American traditionalism and so forth. I was very much, however, a committed sort of liberal activist all the way through high school. Worked for Barack Obama's campaign in 2008, was a great admirer of Barack Obama, still am, to be frank, in many ways. But I looked at the idea of hope and change as being about creating a space for a sort of post-partisan, post-racial society in some sense. I thought that's what kind of the Obama campaign was about. And so a number of things happened in my life, which ironically wound up making me reevaluate my politics in the context of trying to live up to that. A number of things happened that usually tend to make people more conservative. I got married. I got married to a woman who was a soldier. I moved to a military town in the upper Midwest, from Los Angeles to Fort Carson in Colorado Springs. My best friends were soldiers at that time. A little bit of a different environment than the hippies I was hanging out with and so forth in LA. Experienced a religious conversion. My wife came from a traditional Black Baptist, sort of Protestant background. For the first time was discovering sort of the meaning and the value of fellowship and sort of spiritual and religious community. And on top of that, in an effort to sort of bring this spirit of hope and change to Republicans and conservatives, I challenged myself to start doing something I'd never done before, really listening to talk radio, watching Fox News a whole lot more than I ever had, reading books I'd never read before like Atlas Shrugged and Wealth of Nations, the Bible, etc. And just looked up one day and realized, like, holy cow, like, something's kind of shifted in me a little bit over the course of time. I'm still the same guy, but my life has changed in such a way to where conservative values suddenly make a whole lot more sense to me. But I would tell people at that time in my life, and then going forward as I ran for office and got engaged in politics in Los Angeles when we came back home, I tell people, I say, I kind of went from left to right in a lot of ways, but I didn't have an ugly divorce with liberalism, right? I didn't have a nasty breakup with the Democratic Party or anything like that. Fundamentally, I still care about the things I used to care about. Just have some different policy ideas in terms of how we might get certain things done. But there were things that happened in my personal life which changed my story in a way that probably accounts for a lot of the ways in which my politics change. And even though, Kieran, even though you still remain on the left and so forth, your perspective has become a lot more heterodox, a lot more embracing of different points of view, and I think you've got a lot more nuance in the way that you look at things. And so all this just to say that when you're trying to understand American politics today, it's worth recognizing the fact that America's story is changing.
So that is a beautiful story, I have to say.
Thank you very much.
And I think it's interesting, when you hear the story, you actually start to understand.
Right.
Versus if you just hear, okay, I was a liberal, then I was a conservative, it seems very rational. So keeping in mind, A, that our political philosophy is normally based on intuition and emotion rather than rationalism and logic, and B, that we start to see our civic society kind of disintegrating into rancor and vitriol and name-calling, what can we do about it? So Better Angels basically decided, we're going to see if we can apply family therapy to political disagreement.
Right.
Because we figured, well, if we just get people into a room and we say, okay, debate immigration.
Go.
Or debate abortion. That's not going to work out that well. That's going to very much appeal to that rationalism side. And a lot of times people will actually leave the room more polarized than when they came in. Mm-hmm. But if we take an approach that's more about communication and listening, then we might be able to make some progress. So we teamed up with this guy, Bill Doherty. He's a professor at the University of Minnesota, and he's one of the country's most renowned family and marriage counselors. And he designed this idea of a red-blue workshop. And it's essentially either a 3-hour workshop or a day-long workshop in which we bring together 7 reds, so folks who lean conservative tend to vote for Republican, and 7 blues, folks who lean liberal and tend to vote Democrat, and see if we could bring them together for a day to help them better understand one another. The first ground rule of our workshops, which is very important, is you're not here to change anyone's mind.
Right.
You're not here to convince anyone to change their views. You're not here to persuade. You're here to A, listen to try to understand other perspectives, and B, express your own views. Mm-hmm. And in so doing, we found that this process does a number of things. Number one, it naturally starts to restore a bit of a sense of humanity. Because just naturally, when you're talking to people face to face, you're going to start to see them more as a human than compared if you're behind your keyboard on Facebook comments.
Yeah, think about how many things you might say to somebody on Twitter and Facebook that you would probably think twice about saying if that person was right in front of you.
Exactly.
You know, it's funny, quick little anecdote. When I was running for office, I used to have people who would be really nasty to me on Twitter and Facebook and whatnot. And sometimes these were people who I had actually met at events who would get behind their keyboard and say something about me and forget about the fact that I was actually going to be in a room with them the next week. And so always made for a funny little face-to-face moment where it's like, hey, Billy, yeah, I got your comment last week. How you doing, man? Like, oh, hey, you know, I was, I didn't mean that, right, John? I was being funny.
Yeah, that's happened to me too.
Yeah.
Number two, it starts to reduce stereotype thinking because you actually get to hear people you disagree with explain their perspective in their own words. So you start to realize that people are not monolithic. People believe things for all kinds of different reasons, and usually it's informed by their own personal experience. Number three, you start to build a little bit of trust because people start to see that people are coming to the workshop in good faith. They're not there to try to embarrass or humiliate the other side. They're there because they really want to understand and they really want to express themselves, but not do it in a way that's meant to demonize. And so what you have is, even if you disagree with somebody on 90% of things, if you have a little bit of trust and you build a little bit of a relationship, it makes it a lot easier to maybe work with them on that 10% than if you just kind of hate them off the bat. So we did that first workshop in South Lebanon, Ohio, right after the 2016 election. 10 Clinton voters, 10 Trump voters, brought them together for this workshop. When the folks came in, they were pretty polarized, right? They were very suspicious of the other side. People were throwing around stereotypes. There was a lot of tension in the room. After a whole weekend of spending time together, the people actually found, we actually kind of like each other. So there was this one guy named Greg Smith. He's, hardcore Tea Party, Trump supporter. He's a Christian conservative. He's a former police officer. He came into the workshop on the red team. Then there's this guy, Kuyar. He is an immigrant from Iran. He's a devout Muslim, proud progressive. He came in on the blue team. By the end of the workshop, they were like, we actually kind of like each other and want to keep hanging out.
And something crazy happened after that. They wound up fellowshipping together, right? Kuyar came out and paid a visit to Greg at his church and sat in for a service, and Greg actually went and visited a mosque, which earned him some sidewise glances from some of his friends in the neighborhood. But he did that, and Greg continues to try and convert Kuyar, and Kuyar continues to try and turn Greg around. But in the process of so doing, they found ways together to work together for the benefit of their community. More to say on that, but did you want to continue?
Yeah, so we did that first workshop, and we kind of had hopes. We were like, maybe this is an interesting approach, but we were kind of blown away by how much it resonated with the people who participated. And not everyone who participated wanted to keep doing it, but a majority of them said, we want to keep meeting. And so out of that came the first Better Angels Alliance, which is essentially a group of roughly even number of liberals and conservatives in a community who meet on a regular basis, who hold workshops, who hold debates, and who try to bring other people into the fold. So after that first workshop, we raised a little bit of money. We did this bus tour. We actually got this big music tour bus We went around to 10 states, we did 20 workshops, and we started planting the seeds for what would become this larger movement, the Better Angels movement. So today we are now a membership organization. Our dues are just $1 a month, so it's $12 a year if you want to support Better Angels, if you want to organize, if you want to learn how to get trained as a moderator. We intentionally keep our dues really low because we really want Better Angels to reflect America. We want it to be politically diverse. We want it to have working class people. We want it to have people with graduate degrees. We want it to include people from all walks of life. And the idea is that nobody is coming to Better Angels to abandon their perspective or even to moderate their ideas, right? It's not about, oh, let's meet in the mushy middle or let's all become centrist. The idea is I want to understand better our fellow Americans. I want to see if we have maybe more of a common identity than I thought. And I also kind of want to stand up against this polarization that is really being exploited by politicians and the media to further drive us apart. And just the last thing I'll say on that is I've noticed that politics is really increasingly affecting people's mental health in a negative way. So, I mean, in America generally, rates of anxiety are increasing, depression, suicide. I think when you hear people talk about their anxiety, politics sometimes has to do with it, you know. People feel lonely, they feel isolated, they kind of start to feel community by watching cable news or by going on Facebook and scrolling through a feed. And I think one thing that's nice about Better Angels is actually can provide an in-person community where people can sort of draw some meaning and courage and empathy, as John was talking about. So you mentioned the idea of empathy before. Can you talk a little bit about why that's so important to Better Angels and why you guys might be interested in it?
Well, it's funny because you were talking about the polarizing impact of the media. David Brooks, in his recent book, The Second Mountain, he talks about the importance of community. And he talks about tribalism, and he says that the interesting thing about tribalism is that tribal behavior is actually, he says, in some sense, it's the dark twin of community. One of the reasons people are polarized, it's not just, it is because we find ourselves at odds with one another, but it's also because we're looking for connection. And so we're looking for connection in our polarized environments by finding ways in which to sort of bond with one another against some other group. So in other words, we look for common enemies, and through common enemies, we give ourselves a reason to connect with each other. But there's a way in which that is, obviously something that is sort of morally self-sabotaging, right? If my relationship with you is based less off of something that we both affirmatively believe and more off of the fact that there's something that we both hate in common, right? It's a powerfully bitter thing. And so what Better Angels tries to do is, we're generating a sense of community around the idea that there's something affirmative that we have in common, as opposed to there just being something external that we all despise, right? Because that's the type of community that lasts. And that has to be built, ultimately, on empathy, what we call patriotic empathy in Better Angels, the idea that you demonstrate your love for country through your love for the American people in some real sense. And so obviously Better Angels is very exciting in as much as, part of what we're doing is providing people the opportunity, like Greg and Kuyar, to actually, upon having established a relationship, go into their community and find ways in which they can work across the aisle to be able to advocate for the interests that they see themselves as having in common. And so on the national level, Better Angels doesn't tell local Better Angels alliances or chapters what to do. We just get people in a room together and say, okay, you guys are going to know better what's going on in your neighborhood, what's going on in your city, what's going on in your state. So if you can find some common interests to rally around, go ahead. Better Angels will give you the resources to help you be effective where you are. But it starts with the crafting of these relationships across these traditional lines of division. And so empathy is necessary because that comes in the context of our understanding one another's stories. It's very difficult to really have an understanding of the story that lies behind the life experience of your political opponent without seeing some of yourself in it. Because ultimately, it may sound cliche, but we are all human beings, and we can only be so different. On an emotional level, the happiness and fulfillment and true joy at human connection, it's something that we can all relate to. That's why you can watch a movie in a totally different language, not know anything that's going on, and you can see two people in love share a kiss, and it's going to spark you as a powerful thing, even if you didn't understand any of the words leading up to it, because the feelings that come through transcend the language that we use to describe things. And so we try to provide a context through which people can re-arrive at that common understanding of our sort of common human essence, and to craft a story of what it means to be an American that sort of captures that. A story that captures the validity of the values that exist on the left and the right, that go beyond our narrow policy agreements, and that point to the fact that at the end of the day, Americans right and left care about liberty. Americans right and left care about equality, equality of opportunity and equality before the law, and that we have many different roads by which we travel to our own particular political philosophies. But as we become to be more understanding of the texture of those roads, we realize the fact that ultimately, there is kind of an American ideal to which good-natured folks and well-meaning people left and right are aspiring to. And there's a tension in the differences of our experiences that keep us from ever reaching perfect agreement. But if we can go from looking at ourselves and our politics as a zero-sum game bent upon eliminating the other person to recognizing the fact that there is the potential for us to take what is best in our values and forge a common vision of what the future can look like, the future of community, what the future of our interpersonal relationships as Americans might feel like, then we create the basis for a thriving civil society. It doesn't require perfect political agreement, but it does require a love and a civic trust to exist between the American people, left and right. And that's what we seek to create at Better Angels, and that's what we hope to create with all of you. So thank you very much for listening, and we appreciate every one of you. Thank you. Now, I think we do have time for some questions. I think we also have possibly a questionnaire that we're interested in having people fill out. So go ahead.
Yes, thank you guys so much. Before you start running away, they are going to do a Q&A session in a few minutes, but before we do that, we have a survey. So I'm going to ask all you guys to pull out your phones, and you don't need a smartphone. You can use a dumb phone too. And you're just going to text the letters LBCC to the number you see up there on the screen. So I'll give you a few minutes, maybe not a few minutes, but like a good minute to do that.
I've got an Android, but Apple users tell me that's a dumb phone. That's the real line of polarization in our society, by the way. It's Apple versus Android.
Windows versus Mac.
There you go.
Yeah, I've gotten criticism when people see the green bubbles instead of the blue bubbles.
Yeah, exactly. I hate you guys because nobody ever has a charger for me when I need one. Every time I need to borrow a charger, everybody has.
Oh, you don't have an iPhone?
Yeah, exactly. Oh, yeah. Yeah, right. The library. Thank God for the library. Yeah. Right.
All right. How's it looking?
Let's sneak past you real quick. For sure.
Take your time. We'll be here all day.
All right, I think we're gonna get going with this. So here is the first question. What you're gonna do to answer this is just text the letter next to where you're at in response to the question. So if you strongly disagree, it'll be A. Yep, looks like you guys got it.
Oh, you can watch it in real time.
Yeah. Well, that's putting people on the spot. It's like a horse race.
Yeah.
It's like one of those things at baseball stadiums where you have to keep your eye on the different hat.
Yeah. The trick is that they put the ball in their sleeve.
Right. There you go.
All right. Give you like 5 more seconds. All right. Next question. On the whole, I understand and or like people who I disagree with at least a little bit more than I did before this conversation.
Jeez, I feel like this is a report card for me and Kieran here. There we go. Kieran, this is a testament to how likable you are, I'd say.
Well, also important to note that it's and or. So
True.
you don't even have to like, but understand.
All right, looks like we're done getting new answers in. Oop, there's a straggler. But we're gonna go ahead and move on in a second here. All right. Today's discussion made me consider an opposing view in a new light. Not necessarily convince you any which way, just made you think along the lines of, that's interesting.
It's good to see a nice generational mix in this audience, too. We frequently, sometimes we speak to groups that are generationally, sort of homogenous. So it's nice to talk to people across the landscape a little.
All right, I'll give you a few more seconds here.
I said that at an event recently, and an older fellow stood up and said, "I'm here representing antiquity." So
All right, moving on. Compared to before this event, I'm more optimistic about conversing with people whose political views are different than mine. All right, we'll give a few more seconds for any stragglers.
That's encouraging.
I think so.
nobody told me where to place my bets before this.
Oh, no one told you the pool was in the back?
No, I didn't let me know.
Kind of like a little horse race.
All right, moving on. Compared to before this event, I feel like it is more possible that I could learn something from people on the other side of the aisle. All right, we'll give it another moment. And moving on. Do you generally identify as more liberal or more conservative? Where I'm standing may or may not indicate where I personally fall here.
It's pretty balanced. It was slightly different at Berkeley.
It was slightly different.
How was it at Berkeley?
That's right.
All right.
Yeah, if Berkeley, if the representation at Berkeley had been weighted on a scale, the scale would have tilted over. This is great, though.
All right. Any last responses? And we'll continue. What stood out to you most from the conversation and presentation? You can type out more of a short response kind of answer here, and those will start to pop out on the screen. So just share your thoughts.
Hi, Terry. Easier said than done. Very true. We'll have a couple of beers later. Then you'll see the incivility of the presenters. Marriage counseling for politicians. We do that too. Well, not actual marriage counseling, but you get it. Republican, Democrat counseling.
I think some actual marriage counseling might be good.
Well, that's that's likely true. Actually, it is an important metaphor because what Better Angels does is quite literally applying family therapy and marriage counseling techniques to political discourse. I mean, that is the architecture of much of our programming, and there's a reason for that. You know, we are in a civic marriage in the United States, whether we like to think of it that way or not. And so, you know, now let's find the libertarian and see, see where he's at.
All right, I'll give you guys probably like 15 more seconds. Get those answers in.
That one's a little more like some of our Facebook comments.
All right, and we're going to move on now. Any other thoughts, comments, feedback for improvement? Speak now or forever hold your peace. This is like a marriage. Well, we did record it.
Could have been longer. We are giving another presentation at, 3 o'clock today, I think? Yes, at 3 o'clock. Okay. So people who might be interested in coming to that, if you'd like to see some more, if you came late today, it'll be slightly more interactive and more exercise-oriented, but feel free to approach us. We'll let you know the details. It's going to be here on campus. Okay, there we go.
And yeah, in the afternoon workshop, we'll be doing an exercise called Depolarizing Within. So if you like the sound of that, come by.
All right, about 15 more seconds.
Yes.
All right. Any last second responses? Get in there. All right, we'll move on. All right, you can text the word leave to that same phone number, and it's time for a little Q&A session. So
we're doing the Q&A vocally, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
So fire away.
All right.
So the question is, when we do the red and blue meetups, does it ever spill over into bigotry or hate speech? The short answer is very rarely, and that's because the workshops are strictly moderated. So it's not like in the workshops people can just come in and then start saying whatever they want. The first thing is that everyone there has to agree to the ground rules. So first ground rule, as I mentioned, is you're not here to change anyone's mind. The second thing is basically the stuff we all learned in kindergarten. There's no name calling, there's no ad hominem attacks, and that kind of stuff is just really not tolerated. So if somebody sort of starts going off the rails, the moderators are very much there to keep the structure and the integrity of the session.
It's also worth mentioning the fact that there is a little bit of a self-selection bias in terms of people who are participating. It's not to say that our participants are necessarily going to be moderate left or moderate right, but usually if you're going to participate in one of our workshops, you at least have a part of yourself that's open to trying to discover some point of connection with people whose politics are very different from yours. So we don't go out of our way to just find the most radicalized people out there walking around and just drag them into a room together and make them get along. It wouldn't be productive, and it probably wouldn't work very well. But having said that, there always have been and are always going to be people in our society who are just, they're at a point in their personal feelings towards folks on the other side to where it would require some major intervention to get them beyond a genuine sort of place of hatred. But the problem with our current moment is that people who are otherwise very rational and very civil in their lives, are finding themselves unable to relate to each other. And so even if we're, not focused on bringing in the most polarized extremes into the physical workshop space, there's so much of a gap between ordinary Americans at this point that there's plenty of good work to be done in the context of these workshops, bringing together people who, have goodwill but are struggling to find ways to connect and to understand. Yeah, come at 3 o'clock. Yeah, but yeah, you want to speak to that? No, that's fine. But that is what we're talking about. Yeah.
The question was, how do you deal with polarization within your own tribe? And I think that's a really good question. I think one thing it really takes is courage, because we talked about empathy, which is surely important, but also courage, because part of the issue with tribalism is that there's now this sense that even engaging with a perspective or an idea that kind of falls outside the tribal range is somehow akin to surrendering your own, which is really not true, and actually the opposite is true. If you are able to engage with either the other side or the whole spectrum of ideas within your own side, that's actually how you strengthen your own ideas and your own arguments. Because if you're only existing in an echo chamber where everyone's just agreeing with you and you're just virtue signaling, you're actually not going to be very good at either communicating or defending your ideas. And so I would recommend that it takes a little bit of courage, because you can get called out, right? It's like people can say, why are you fraternizing with the enemy? Or, you're just enabling, or you're normalizing. But at Better Angels, we find that when people actually get exposed to different ideas, they actually find that it kind of re-energizes their own moral culture and political value system.
Yeah, right. So part of what we try and teach people is, first of all, how to depolarize within yourself, right? How to sort of adjust your ways of thinking about your political opposition to where there's a good deal more nuance in your understanding of why other people think the way they do, so that you can sort of modify your emotional reactions to things that might trigger a certain sort of response within yourself when somebody says a certain thing politically, or maybe says something to you that you might consider offensive. And then we try and show people and give people techniques for bringing a nuanced perspective into conversations that they have with people on their own side of the aisle. So you don't have to disagree. I wouldn't have to disagree with a fellow conservative on an issue like healthcare to be able to make the point to them that, well, hey, look, buddy, I agree with you. I think that we need more of a market sort of force in delivering our healthcare system. But before you go saying that folks on the left are just people who want government to run every aspect of their lives, let me tell you, I know a lot of people in communities like my own in South LA who have grown up, their whole life having to rely on Medicaid as a way of accessing health care. So, when Republicans talk about about changing the health care system in a way that sort of prohibits the expansion of Medicaid, I believe they're free market solutions, and you and I, fellow conservative, we believe they're free market solutions to this problem. But you've got to understand that this hits a real sensitive emotional place in the experiences that people actually have, because people do have positive experiences with government programs. And so let's introduce some nuance into our understanding of the other side before we judge them as simply being ideological, as opposed to speaking from a place of some actual real experience. So, thank you.
Thank you. Other questions?
Yeah, a little bit of devil's advocate here, but I'm not.
That's all right.
I appreciate the need to the idea to create and look at different opinions in life. But you have to live in a system that doesn't reward that.
Mm-hmm.
Live in a political life, that doesn't reward that behavior. To stand apart and vote against your party position, this type of politics is suicidal.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. No, it's a good point. So you guys, you've heard our description of the work of Better Angels and the basic sort of spirit of our mission. But on a practical level, a major part of what we want to accomplish and what others in this space want to accomplish is to create a demand in our society for a new type of politics. And the problem that you're talking about, the problem of these sort of perverse incentives to cater to the sort of, I guess, worse angels of our nature, if you will. The incentive that exists in the media establishments and in the political parties to capitalize on our instinct towards tribal divisions, that's something that cannot really be changed unless we stir a broader outcry in our society for a new sort of norm in terms of our discourse, in terms of the way candidates campaign, in terms of the way pundits talk. And so at Better Angels, part of what we're seeking to do is to actually build out an organizing structure through not just these workshops, but through the alliances, through original media content that we are producing. We've got a podcast, Better Angels Podcast, which you might want to look into, and a network of writers. And we have programs on college campuses and workshops that we're deploying in municipal and state governments, and actively seeking partnerships with other organizations that are working in a complementary fashion. The idea is to create a political base, not so much for political centrism, but for political decency, interpersonal decency in our civic society, and to create a place where people on the left and the right who want to see a shift in this type of behavior out of the powers that be in our politics have a place to essentially meet and work together in order to stimulate it. Because right now, if you want to get involved in politics in an active way, you sort of have to go into a polarizing environment. And I say this as a person who ran for office as a Republican. I'll go to a Republican club meeting, this has happened to me a number of times, where I'll hear somebody shouting a lot of red meat, a lot of vitriol and so forth, and the audience claps and cheers, and then I'll go and talk to people individually, and I say, I'm with a group called Better Angels, and we're actually trying to create understanding between Democrats and Republicans. And then the person will grab my hand and shake and say, oh my God, we need you so much. Thank you so much. Lock her up! Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate what you're doing, So just the simple answer to your question is we need to create a structural space for people on the left and right to organize in advocacy of a new type of politics and media content that serves as an alternative to what's out there now. So it's a big job, but there are a lot of people working on it within and beyond Better Angels.
And the only thing I'd add to that is I think you can't overestimate the power of changing norms to change political behavior. I mean, if you look at the Me Too movement, for example, that's really been about changing norms around sexual harassment and sexual assault. And that's only been, 18 months old, and you're already seeing all sorts of repercussions in terms of how people behave in the workplace, how people behave in politics. So I think ultimately our goal right now is to build this movement, this grassroots movement that's going to shift norms based on relationships. And then the filtering up effect that we hope to see is one that's going to change political behavior. But you're totally right. I mean, the headwinds are stiff here. We're not pretending that this is going to be easy or that there aren't tall barriers. I mean, from just gerrymandering to money in politics to the media profit complex. I mean, these are big forces aligned against us. But when you actually take things down to the grassroots level and person to person, you start to build that energy. And we've certainly noticed that there's an appetite for what we're doing. And so if we can fill that appetite, we'll see where things go. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, and I think, I mean, for me, I think competition can be good so long as it happens on the field and it's a competition of ideas. But what we're seeing now is more like, you know, one team trying to blow up the other team's tour bus, right, before the game even starts.
Yeah.
John, what were you going to say on this one?
No, I mean, well, it's a great point, but think about sports for a moment. You know, when you have, you know, two teams playing against each other on the football field, the basketball court, the baseball field, or what have you. Yeah, you know, they play their guts out. They knock each other down on the field. People get tackled. People get injured. People play hard, and, you know, victory is really sweet, and defeat can be very, very painful when the stakes are high. But what do we do when the game is over? We meet out in center field, and we shake hands, right? Because at the end of the day, the game itself is bigger than the players, you know? The game of a free society, so to speak, the game of our democratic republic is bigger than the political parties, or at least it should be. And that's the norm that we have to reestablish. I agree with you, Kieran. I'm a firm believer in competition, in the competition of ideas. I think it strengthens us. And by the way, I think teams are okay, you know? We are always going to have narrower groups of people who we have a little bit more in common with, or at least commonalities that are more proximal. But ultimately, you know, that can never be allowed to supersede our broader sort of commitment to a larger identity that we share as Americans. Because if it does, then the basis for our civil society begins to unravel. And sadly, that's part of what we're starting to see now.
What are some emotional and economic benefits that we might use to appeal to bipartisan collaboration?
Emotional economic benefits. That's an interesting phrasing. I think that part of the reason why I believe in the idea of a civil society movement is because I do look at politics as sort of a competition of ideas largely over or to a certain degree at least, over the material sorts of challenges of our society. But that level of discourse rests on top of, it's only as effective as the health of the communities that undergird it, if that makes some sense. So in other words, I mean, Kieran, I like Kieran's analogy about now it's like, you know, one team tries to blow up the other team's tour bus before they even get to the stage. That's something you do if you don't believe that you have any sort of civil or interpersonal obligation to the people on the other team. And so why do I mention that? It's because right now, even though we're living in the midst of a good economy, materially speaking, we're in the midst of sort of a depression in terms of our emotional economy in some respects, in terms of the sort of psychological health of the American people. Kieran spoke to that in our presentation. And this rampant polarization is something that is detracting from our ability to build social capital in our communities, to relate to one another in our own families, to preserve our actual interpersonal relationships.
one of the reasons I love Better Angels is because the work just feels good. It feels
Yeah, that's
good.
what I was going to say.
Yeah, it just feels good to create relationships with people that you didn't really think was necessarily, possible to accomplish that with.
It's really been life-changing for some people who've come in, and they come in maybe skeptical or suspicious, or they think it's cool. They think, oh, I'm just going to do a workshop, and then they find, wow, this is really what's needed, and then they start to get more involved, and they really build friendships. And so we have a lot of these kind of beautiful stories of strong friendships and strong relationships that have emerged across the aisle, or people came to us and originally said, I feel like I can't talk to my father after 2016, and through Better Angels have learned ways to communicate that doesn't mean that they're never necessarily going to agree, but they're actually able to return to a more healthy and loving relationship, which is ultimately to put it in your term, their emotional, economic best interest.
Right, so one short answer at least would be, if you feel pain by not having any faith in the goodness of people on the other side, if you want to know what it feels like to have your faith in your fellow Americans restored, get involved in this kind of work, because that's what it'll do.
Oh, yes.
So I'm kind of feeding off of what this gentleman said about all of us feeling like we have to be on a team. In my life, we've had, Republican presidents, we've had Democratic presidents, and at the end of the race, we're able to come together and just support the president that we have. But I feel like this is a different time. I don't feel that we're doing that. We could do that. And I feel that this is much more than that. So for me, I'm independent. And I've voted Republican before, and I've voted Democratic before. But now I feel like this is much more than that. It's not, for me, I'm almost feeling like we need to get rid of everyone in Washington, D.C. and just start all over, and everybody needs to be independent, So, so I just feel like, how do you do that? I do think it's important for us to sit and talk and be able to understand each other without beating each other up. But at the same time, we need to see that we need to kind of put the labels away and start working together, because our country is a young country. And we all know that, everybody says that we're going to be our own demise at the end. If we don't start working together and stop putting labels on us, how can we grow? How can we grow as a society? I think that's where I'm at. And right now, and you're right, you guys talked about how this has given so many of us depression and anxiety, and you don't realize that it's doing that because you're so set on your ways that you're just wanting to get your point out there. Right. But I'll be one to admit that it has given me a lot of anxiety whenever I turn on, or read Facebook or Instagram or whatever out there. I just don't understand what's going on anymore. I don't see this as a Democratic thing or a Republican thing. I see this as we're in deep trouble and we need to change this. So.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's worth noting, just as a quick aside on social media, that social media will tarnish your faith in humanity very quickly. But there's actually a lot of reason to think that the nastier comments you see on Facebook and Twitter are not really reflective of the way most Americans feel. There's a bit of a phenomenon, I think there's even a clinical term for it, which I'm forgetting, but there's sort of a phenomenon where people who have the strongest and most aggressive views on something or feelings on a particular issue or on another group of people are the quickest to make themselves heard. And so 5% of people in a given room can sound like 50%, make you think that that's the way 50 or 75% of people in that space are.
Well, because a lot of the other people are just saying, oh, this is too unpleasant.
Yeah, right, exactly. Most people are like you and just, tuning it out, or, just don't even want to jump into the cesspool of social media conversation. So let's not let, Twitter activists from either side sort of distort our sense of where we're at as Americans. But you're right, though. We're in a tough place, and there's a tension worth appreciating, particularly for Better Angels members, but for anybody who's out here involved in this kind of work. There's this tension where we have people who are coming together as Democrats and Republicans, liberals, conservatives, reds, blues, what have you, to find this common ground and to forge this sense of shared community and shared American identity, if you will. But at the same time, each side knows in our community, in our organization, in our local alliances and so forth, that their friends on the other side are going to go out and probably, support the other candidate, right? So on the one hand, we know that within Better Angels, we're competing against each other in the general political marketplace. And that's fine. That's the idea. But we're also coming together, and we're going to oppose each other, pretty fiercely on that end. But then we also have created a space where we can come back together and remind each other of what's most important, and create the context for some integrity to exist in terms of the political conversation and hopefully how we treat each other in the context of our political operations, maybe even on a governing level. And so balancing these two things out, the idea that on the one hand, we're competitors, on the other hand, we're fellow Americans who are working proactively on things that are deeper than our policy disagreements. That's the line that we have to walk, but that's the line that has always allowed our democratic society to persist.
Yeah, and the only other thing I'd say that's helpful for me to think about is I think there's kind of a difference between politicians and people who live and breathe politics and work in politics and ordinary people, because I think you're right, in many ways the political circumstances right now in the federal government are extraordinary in a lot of ways, and we're seeing a lot of things that are unprecedented, and so people feel like their reaction sort of needs to be in equal measure. But I think when you get sort of away from politics into regular people's lives, they don't really have the luxury of taking that approach to their relationships, right? I mean, if you're in your family and someone that you love and is close to voted differently from you, I guess you sort of have a choice, right? Am I going to make this sort of a defining hallmark of our relationship, that we disagree on politics and things are so crazy right now that I need to take a stand against you, and until you change your mind, I don't want to talk to you. I mean, that's sort of the choice that you have to make. And so Better Angels, it is very therapeutic in a way, because it helps people understand a little bit that it's more okay to disagree than they might think if they're so wrapped up in it every single day. Up there?
So actually that leads into my question. What is the marriage and family counseling tips that you have for that one person in your family of 6 that you want to not talk to anymore?
Sure. Well, I think one of the first things to keep in mind, and I've mentioned this several times, but I think it's really worth beating the drum on it, is don't try to change their mind, because they're not going to, most likely. The second thing I'd say is it's important, if you want to talk politics, to use what's called I statements. So sort of frame your beliefs in I feel this way because, or I have this experience that's led me to think about this way, versus sort of using this is the way things are, or can't you see that, or everyone knows this. The other thing I'd say that people tend to do is they want to...
Even if your opinion is factually correct, don't treat it as a fact. Don't state it like, I said this and therefore it is a fact, right? The I framing is very important. Yeah.
The other thing I was going to say that one of the traps people often fall into in conversations is that they start characterizing the other side. So they'll say, if you're a Democrat, you'll say, well, Republicans, blah, 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 blah. And then the other side is already defensive and saying, well, why are you characterizing me in this way that I don't feel about myself? And people tend to ascribe the perceived characteristics of a certain politician on the other side to the person, right? So if a politician said something that they find very offensive, they might assume automatically that that person supports what they said. So I think it's important to be curious, it's important to be humble, and it's important to maybe pull back a little bit before you build a little bit of trust. So it can be helpful to kind of credit something to the other person's side and maybe express a reservation that you might have about your own side before you really dig into issues, because that tends to kind of lower the temperature a little bit. And what are you going to say?
No, just agreeing.
But if you're interested, you should come to our workshop today, because we're going to be running through these sort of specific skills about how you can have difficult political conversations in a practical context. But I think, again, if the goal in your head is that I am going to get this person to change their mind, then you've kind of, ruined it off the bat because you're not going to be able to. But if the goal is, I'm going to express myself so they understand me, and I'm going to be able to understand them, and through that, we're going to be able to repair our relationship and build trust. If that's what you both want, then it can work. I mean, if that's not what you want, or that's not what the person you're talking to wants, fundamentally, it's going to be difficult. But I think deep down, people really do want that if they can sort of let go of the defensive posture that we so often find ourselves in politics. Because we're so used to this argumentative framework. So as soon as somebody brings up a political viewpoint that's different from yours, you're sort of automatically already like this, right? You know, you have your talking points, right? And so you're not even really listening to them. You're kind of more waiting to say something. And so if you can build this structure where you're actually listening and then you're actually expressing yourself, that's when you build understanding. And one of the things we do in our workshop is an exercise called a fishbowl. And so, for example, in a fishbowl, you'll have all the conservatives on one team, for example, sitting in the middle, right, in a circle. And then you'll have all the liberals sitting in a circle around them. And so when you're in the middle, you get to talk. And when you're outside, you just get to listen. You literally can't talk. And so what this does is it gives one side the opportunity to hear the other side in their own words for almost 15 to 20 minutes, right? So you actually get to listen and hear them talk in your own words. And so, A, you start to understand they're not as monolithic as I thought. B, you get to clarify the disagreements, because the disagreements are there, right? It's not like you're going to hear them speak and say all of a sudden, well, wow, we actually agree on everything. It's like, no, we're going to clarify where these disagreements lie, and you're going to start to illuminate some commonality, and you're going to start to build understanding, and you're actually going to start to build some trust. So that was a bit of a jumbled answer, but I hope it was helpful in providing some qualitative guidance.
There you go. I see someone down here in front.
So I served 4 years in the United States Marine Corps, actually 7 months over in the Middle East. And so I went from the American view to understanding how they are over there, and just having respect for them, whether you like them or not, for the people or the heritage or whatever you will, just having respect. And I see that's a lot of things after I came back that Americans have a really hard time adapting to, respecting someone's opinion. You don't have to like the individual per se, but at least respect where they're coming from, or at least hear where they're coming from. So I served under both presidents, and I like one more than the other, but I respect the position and what they did to get into office, because it's not something you can just go and do. And so I think a lot of people are just, they're putting their guard up and going into the fight right away before they hear both sides of it. And so it's very naive of both sides to think that I'm right because my political party wins this way and this way, and then looking at either CNN or Fox and thinking, oh, I have to believe this because of this. You're just listening to their rhetoric and believing it just because that's the stance. And
Right.
you're putting yourself in that box, that thing that we want to not be a part of, and you're doing that to yourself by sticking with it just because you're red or you're blue. Like, I would agree with a lot with what you said, but maybe not everything you say, but I respect the fact that you guys can come up there and speak in this kind of a format and have civil discourse. And I think that's extremely key, and it's lacking within generations. And so being able to speak from
Yeah.
being older and younger and having the respect and open dialogue, and then going from there. So
Thank you.
just see that more, just to applaud you guys for doing what you guys do and having more of an understanding of what it is. And then my second part was just, I believe a lot of the hashtag #MeToo movement is important, and what it's doing is good. But at the same point in time, I think what you gentlemen are doing is super important also. But why is it that your guys' side of things hasn't taken off? Because it seems like a lot of people have the same thoughts, and it would spiral or snowball into being a bigger thing. Why do you guys think
Yeah.
it hasn't done that?
Yeah, well, part of it is creating the structure for it, which gets back to the gentleman's question sitting towards the middle. But I just want to say really quick, thank you for bringing up the armed services, because I like to think of Better Angels as being basic training for civil discourse in some respects for the American people. And, you know, I mentioned my wife is a veteran, and I never served, but there was a time when my best friends were all soldiers. In fact, my very best friend, whose children are my godchildren, me and my wife's godchildren, he died in an attack by the Taliban in Afghanistan right after the 2016 election. I was at my 30th birthday when I got birthday party when I got the call. And thinking back on, the friendships I had with the soldiers stationed at Fort Carson, I'm sure political polarization was an issue to some degree, but the amazing thing about people in the armed forces is that they come from all walks of American life, right? I mean, you guys, you would have served with people who were from every part of the country, right? And every racial group and so forth. And so people come together, and because there's a common mission, at least this was my experience observing my friends in the Army, because there's a common mission, there's a common sort of framework for managing our disagreements, where they were able to sort of listen to each other's points of view with earnestness, with humility, sort of learn about the backgrounds of the other people they were working with, agree or disagree, but then, fold all that into getting the job done, right? And so I do think that American society could benefit a lot more from that kind of a value system, more broadly speaking, where we're able to be mindful and honoring of our differences, but then fold that into a commitment to a larger cause, that being the well-being of the American people and the interests of the United States.
And the other point you hit on, which I think also speaks to your question, is a lot of time the political arguments that we have can become very superficial and talking points driven, because when you have a deeper and richer and more philosophical conversation with somebody, they might go into the conversation kind of just repeating, maybe what they heard on last night's cable news program. But if you actually just ask somebody, why are you a liberal? Or why do you identify as a conservative, right? That sort of gets to a deeper and more nuanced question where someone goes inside themselves and starts to talk about their philosophy and their experiences and what they really believe. And that ultimately paints a much richer picture, and you can start to see commonalities versus, if you're just talking about the latest thing from the Mueller report or the latest Trump tweet, right? Then it's both people are going to be they have their talking points, they're going to be very superficial. So one thing we try to do at Better Angels is give people a space for some of those deeper conversations that people don't actually have. I mean, people can be talking politics every day, and not actually talk about, well, why are you a liberal? What reservations do you have about liberalism? Do you see any value in conservatism? And when you actually ask those probing questions, it can be challenging at first because you have to be kind of vulnerable and you have to look into yourself. But once you get to that point, it kind of opens you up and sort of breeds that natural empathy and understanding, and usually does help, I'd say. Yeah.
Looks like we have time for one more question.
Well, so I'm going to put a prompt to you if I can. We have a lot of self-directed learners in this environment, as an academic environment. Are there books that you've read? Are there, videos or TED Talks that you have found valuable to you in taking this journey to develop these skills?
That's a great question. I mentioned The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, and that's a great book to read if you want to sort of familiarize yourself with what he terms the moral foundations of left and right. We all have a catalog of moral commitments which are important to us. But if you spread it out across the political landscape, one thing you'll learn is that there are certain moral themes which find themselves a bit more pronounced on the left than on the right, and vice versa. And understanding those themes provides a basis for us in terms of how it is we can go about communicating to people who hold sort of, moral values that we can appreciate, but maybe in different proportions than we ourselves exhibit, and so forth. And so, in conservative cultures, there tends to be much more of a focus on loyalty as a preeminent value, and tradition as a preeminent value. In liberal cultures, there tends to be a bit more of a focus on compassion and fairness as values. But these are still values that matter, typically speaking, that matter across the board. But the way we emphasize different things according to our personal experiences will differ. And so it's a great book for sort of understanding the kind of psychological landscape of our differences and informing our communication. Kieran, is there something that strikes you?
Yeah, another book that just came out, it's called The Second Mountain by David Brooks, which is about his ideas for communitarianism and shared identity across difference. And the last thing I would say in addition to books is the news you consume. I think it's really important to make an effort to try to consume news that comes from an alternate perspective that you don't agree with necessarily, because again, that'll kind of inform your opinion so you have a broader understanding of a certain issue. and it'll also give you a more accurate sense of where people are coming from. So there are some good websites out there, like, for example, it's The Flip Side, which is run by a friend of ours, and that's basically a daily 5-minute newsletter that arrives in your inbox and will break down the news of the day from left, right, and center. So you can kind of quickly scan each news item and sort of get an understanding of how different sides are covering it. Because if you're only reading news every day from one side, that can kind of warp your understanding of the news and also your understanding of society and kind of build that more tribal attitude. Whereas if you expose yourself to a broad array of viewpoints, you're going to have a much fuller understanding of politics, culture, and American society.
Also, look up a TED Talk from Sally Kohn, who's Kohn. She's a journalist with CNN at one point. Someone we interviewed. I can't remember the name of it, but she's got some great comments on emotional intelligence and the need to sort of understand intuitively where the other person in the conversation is coming from. And also, TED Talk by this guy, I think his name is Theo something. He was an African-American man who went deep into white supremacist online forums to try and understand sort of the perspectives of people who are coming from, not conservatives, but people who are white nationalists. And he basically posed as a member of that community in order to try and understand where they were coming from. And lo and behold, amazingly, he found all sorts of human-level things that he was able to relate to in this community, and it drew him into deeper dialogues with people who it wound up being, even in the white nationalist community, he was able to find some humanity to which he was able to speak. So you might have to search around a bit for that because I can't recall the name, but those are a couple of recommendations. This has been fantastic. Really appreciate you guys, and it's an honor for me and Kieran to be here. And yeah, let's go forth and summon our better angels and depolarize America. Thank you all so much.
So on behalf of the Free Expression team, we greatly thank you. The students are going to say their own words in a second. So there is that opportunity today at 3 o'clock in the fireside room if you want to work on some skills and have more time with our guests. There also is an opportunity tomorrow in the fireside room at 3 o'clock. We are continuing our conversations on inclusiveness and on being a campus where every student finds people that they identify with, finds the person that they have shared interests with, and we are discussing how to do that, and while we do that, we are developing stronger relationships with each other. So if you're interested in doing the work and helping us move forward to be a more inclusive environment, please also consider Fireside Room tomorrow at 3.
All right, we'd just like to thank each and every one of you for coming today and for keeping such an open mindset. That's exactly what it needs for this movement to take off. And thank you, John and Kieran, for coming today.